Do you remember the first time you found yourself lost in a book? My mom tells me that I started reading when I was around 3 years old. I was actually 8 months old when I started organizing my books by size, color, and in alphabetical order. I quickly advanced from picture books to early reader chapter books to volumes of fantasy and self-help. I would visualize myself as a thin, graceful princess with smooth ivory skin, long blonde hair, and 2 perfect, loving parents. I admired Jo from Little Women and her tenacity in being a free-spirited writer, following her dreams despite what society told her. Hermione's wit and know-it-allness, coming up with clever and witty solutions to help her friends, and the imagination of Anne of Green Gables, who turned her entire world and the most hopeless of situations into colorful fairy tales. But looking in the mirror constantly reminded me that I would never look like or be like the heroines I so loved and looked up to. As a Dominican mixed-race girl growing in a single-parent household, I did not feel represented in the books I consumed. There was a disconnect between me and the subjects of the fairy tales and other books I read because I did not and could not relate. I found myself wondering why there couldn't be a Latina princess or heroine with a curvy body, thick brown hair, and a single mom. So I set out on my own journey to find these characters in books. I pored over hundreds of books, longing for a character like me, one I could read about and feel an instant connection. I dreamed of the day I could read about a character and think, wow, they're just like me. It turns out I'm not alone in these experiences, at least in terms of publication statistics. Lee and Low Books conducted a diversity baseline study in 2019, finding that in the publishing industry, there is an evident problem with representation and diversity. 76% of authors in the industry self-reported as white or Caucasian, and this is reflected in the characters they write about. As one quote by musician Lane Staley puts it, "We write about ourselves because we know about ourselves." Since most authors are white, there aren't many Latino characters in books. Feeling this disconnect urged me to look for answers. Where were the characters and authors of color? Why was there such an issue with representation in publishing? What could I do about it? Little Elisha was frustrated and devastated, really, because no one looked or acted like her in the books she was reading. I remember asking my mom these same questions, and how she responded inspired me and directed me to the path I'm on today, to be here on this stage. She encouraged me to be the solution. So I decided to do something about it and pursue a degree in editing and publishing. I found that no one else was talking about this representation issue. My goal became increasing and improving the representation of people of color in literature so that they could feel seen and heard. I recently completed a thesis at my university with the aim to talk to young adults of color and ask for their thoughts on representation in literature. I surveyed over 400 young adults who identified as Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, and otherwise people of color from ages 18 to 26, asking them a series of questions on how we can improve the portrayal of BIPOC, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in literature, how literary inclusion impacts their reading habits, and most importantly, how representation impacts their lives. After months of intensive research, I confirmed that representation does matter. I discovered that young adults of color really crave representation in the books they're reading. They want to see more main characters like them, with stories centered around BIPOC narratives. Feeling seen and heard by book characters prompts us as readers to read more often and enjoy the books we're reading more. Young adults of color express that when they see themselves represented in these stories, they feel empowered. As one participant said, it's important for young people to see themselves represented in the stories that they read. It makes them feel like they can be the hero of their own story and that they can achieve anything they want to achieve. It also helps them realize that there are people like them out there and that they might not be alone in the experiences that they're feeling, facing challenges or feeling different from others. Do you see how powerful that is? Representation can also have a positive impact on identity, helping young adults find their place not only within a story, but in the world. One young woman expressed, quote, "Having diversified characters with different races and ethnicities would have had a profound impact on my identity as a biracial female. This would have been instrumental as a teenager, but even now as I navigate race and gender roles in America," end quote. These young adults also brought up a crucial point. It's not just representation that matters, but the natural integration and normalization of stories about people of color. I love how one girl put this, quote, "Just more natural inclusion would mean a lot. It doesn't have to be overt. I remember being obsessed with the Hunger Games for the tiny details of Katniss having darker skin and being a really quiet individual who struggled to make friends, which is exactly what I was like growing up. It was so impactful to me because never before had I had a story with a character like that or like me," end quote. The second thing I found was that we need to talk more about the stereotypes and book themes that discourage young adults of color from reading. One respondent mentioned one of their main pet peeves is when authors include several random ethnicity side characters to simply fill a diversity quota. Yet these characters have no personality, no character development, and no real culture that can appeal to audiences of color. As people of color, we are hyper aware of these stereotypes. Asian characters are seen as smart sidekicks, and Asian women are often shown as quiet or submissive. Black characters are sometimes characterized as violent or even abusive. Latin or Hispanic characters are similarly rendered as criminals, overly sexualized, or put in domestic service roles. Not only do these stereotypes create a disconnect between young adults of color and the literature we consume, it also takes a toll on our own self-worth and our perception of our own value in the world. I remember seeing Hispanic characters written as the antagonists, the bad guys, and the women specifically were destined for no more than a life in the background, or worse, torn down and degraded by other characters. The representations I saw of my own culture in not only books but other forms of media were demeaning, dehumanizing, and demoralizing. Watching these representations confused and saddened me. Was I anything more than entertainment for white peers to poke fun at? I remembered seeing Latina women represented as uneducated and unskilled. My mom would often get comments assuming her to be less capable or only capable of harm in the predominant white communities that we lived in. It was really heartbreaking for me to watch people treat her like a second-rate citizen. I can't help but wonder whether the media that these white communities consumed was largely responsible for their racial bias. Perhaps if our culture had been portrayed realistically and authentically, things might have been different. Possibly my favorite quote from a survey participant summed all this up perfectly. Quote, "Write us as more than our stereotypes. Show more of our multifaceted qualities because we all are, at the end of the day, people." The final important observation I made is that there simply isn't enough awareness about current literature that does include diverse characters. When asked for recommendations on what we can do to improve representation and increase representation of people of color in literature, one person said, "Make these books more widely known to young adults of color. I never read any books with Hispanic characters because I never hear of any," end quote. Young adults need these books in mainstream publishing, and these books must be included in our homes, our workplaces, and our classrooms. As we see with these quotes and these stories, the lack of representation in publishing needs to be addressed. We must do better. When young people see themselves represented positively in literature, it could boost their self-esteem, help them develop a positive sense of identity, and maybe even lead to greater success in life. On the other hand, when they're constantly bombarded with negative stereotypes and depictions of people in their ethnic or racial groups, it can have the opposite effect and lead to feelings of inadequacy and low self-worth. It's not just about the impact on young people, however. The lack of representation in publishing also has wider societal implications. When we don't see people of color represented in the mainstream, it reinforces the notion that we're somehow other or different from the norm. This can lead to prejudice and discrimination, and many people may subconsciously or consciously view people of color as less important or less valuable than others. Representation can rewrite our society's narrative of exclusion and homogeneity into one of inclusion and celebration of diversity. I have dedicated my professional life so far to researching the representation of people of color in literature, yet much more needs to be done. So what can we do to push for more change? I've come up with 3 crucial steps. 1, first, we need to increase the number of diverse authors so that we can ensure that a wider range of voices and perspectives are represented in literature. I've contributed to this myself by writing and publishing my own works to add to the current collection of books written by Latina authors. If a young adult of color is watching this, on the fence about picking up the pen and telling their story, I tell you to do it. We need you and we need your stories. Continue reading and writing and don't give up hope, because it's through us that this change can happen. If you have a young adult of color in your life, encourage them to write themselves into the narrative and provide them with the tools and resources that they need to succeed as writers. Second, we need to emphasize using more sensitivity, respect, and accuracy when telling stories about people of color. We need to encourage authors to write more complex and nuanced characters of color, moving beyond the tired old tropes that have been perpetuated for decades. We can do this by listening to authentic stories of people of color, reaching out to them with the aim of centering the narrative around them. And don't be afraid to speak up. Be willing to talk about the stereotypes that make you uncomfortable, and specifically why they shouldn't be used in the first place. We especially need more people who don't belong to the BIPOC communities to advocate for our voices, willing to hold the torch and amplify our concerns. Finally, we need to keep talking about this issue. By having conversations like the one we're having today, we can raise awareness of the importance of representation in publishing. Research authors of color so you can purchase and read their works. Support independent bookstores run by people of color, and get involved in reading initiatives during Black History Month, Native American Heritage Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, and Asian and Pacific Islanders Month. Through these actions, we can encourage publishers to do better. We can inspire young adults of color to get involved and write their own stories. Imagine what the world would be like if everyone's story was told. We can rewrite the narrative together. Thank you.